Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Europe. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We're going to have an excellent discussion today on a wonderful paper written by Ariel Cohen about the vulnerabilities in Russia as it conducts this war of aggression on Ukraine. And to discuss this paper with Ariel, we have a terrific panel. We have Sergei Alexashenko, the former Deputy Minister of Finance of the Russian Federation. We have Evelyn Farkas, the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. We have Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, who is a distinguished senior fellow at the Eurasia Center, the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council, and a former ambassador to Moscow, a former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, former Assistant Secretary of Defense. You get the idea. And finally, we have Dov Zakheim, who's also a director on the board of directors of Atlantic Council, a former Undersecretary of Defense with a great deal of experience at senior levels in Washington dealing with national security. With that, Ariel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Herbst. I want to thank the outstanding team at the Atlantic Council, Alex Swalina, Andrew Danieri, and the editorial team. Without you guys, this report would never come out. And of course, the leadership of Ambassador Herbst, thank you. Russia, I argue, has peaked in terms of its military production, finances, human resources, and even information warfare. It still achieves some amount of progress from its point of view by throwing thousands and thousands of soldiers into the fight in Ukraine. The soldiers are not well trained, they're not well led. And also we notice some political wins for Russian allies in Europe, particularly the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD party in Germany, and the far right in Austria. Having said that, in the paper, please read the paper, I argue that the main advantage of the West is that our potential, the potential of the United States, Western Europe, EU, with close to $50 trillion GDP, plus our Asian democratic allies, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, etc. So we're looking at $60+ trillion. Our potential has not been mobilized. We, the West, needs mobilizing our military production, our military training for Ukraine, providing weapons to Ukraine, and at the same time, a much better coordination and strategy on sanctions. If we have that political will to win the war, we can and we should be able to win the war. And as I argued repeatedly in publications years back, Russia is not 9 feet tall. It has an aggressive stance, but its weaknesses go across the board in terms of poor motivation and leadership of its troops, in terms of deficit of spare parts and components, especially in high tech. They need to procure it either from the West or from China. They procure it through proxies and third parties in countries ranging from Turkey and United Arab Emirates, Central Asian countries, countries in the Caucasus, especially Armenia, to, of course, China. The other whole theater of economic warfare, I argue, is in the fact that we, the United States, the Biden administration, allowed Russia to benefit from oil sales past the Great Invasion of 1922. For example, the revenue of Russia in terms of oil sales alone, putting gas aside, the revenues from oil is $200 billion. The total GDP of Ukraine is 190 billion. So Russia is getting a lot of money from oil sales, Russia is still continuing to sell gas, natural gas, both in terms of LNG, liquefied natural gas, and pipe gas to what I call the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, the landlocked countries in Europe, Hungary, Austria, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. So if we can address that, if we can deny that cash flow, that will be a big boon for Ukraine and for the West. And Russia is poorly led. While in the paper I bring examples of real catastrophic failures, the Crimean War of the 19th century, when the Black Sea, as a result, was demilitarized and great liberalizing reforms by the Tsar Alexander II took place. The Russo-Japanese War, when the regime of Nicholas II was partially liberalized, and of course, the Tsar went back on that. The catastrophic failure in World War I, when the Tsarist regime collapsed and the two revolutions ensued with the catastrophic results, not just for the Russian people, but for people around Russia with the Bolshevik dictatorship. The very problematic performance in the Winter War against Finland, and of course, the failure in Afghanistan, after which the Gorbachev regime collapsed. So what I'm saying is the failure of Russia to perform in wartime more often than not results in either liberal reforms or the collapse of the regime. And I argue that if the West mobilizes, the West leads well, the Putin regime either will have to stop and rethink what they're doing, just like the Soviet regime did after the death of Stalin, or possibly the whole regime might be swept out by the end of this decade if the defeat is serious. Another area, and I'll wrap it up soon, of what we need to focus on, in my view, is one, highlighting the corruption. Even after the removal of Defense Minister Shoigu and his replacement by a non-military man, the economist Andrei Belousov, the corruption is continuing. We saw a lot of people close to Putin were appointed as deputy defense ministers, including Putin's relative Anna Tsivilova. And the Russian people do not know enough about the pervasive corruption in the military and in the procurement. And that brings me to the final point for this presentation, and that is the information warfare dimension. We did not do enough in information warfare. We did not mobilize people who are Putin's opponents, who left Russia and who are willing to fight in social media, in publications and film, etc. We are not doing a great job adjusting the sanctions also to allow those people who oppose Putin to leave Russia, especially people with STEM and engineering degrees and professions. And we are not, therefore, weakening the Russian military-industrial complex and the Putin regime. To conclude, Western victory will not be possible without US and European allies and other democracies who had realized the global nature of this conflict. Ukraine is an important theater, but not the only theater. The Russian ally and strategic partner and Chinese strategic partner, Iran, is trying to project its power through proxies throughout the Middle East, and Russia and China are using North Korea as its attack dog or battering ram in the Pacific. Success in Ukraine will send a clear message that US and our allies are willing to fight and win. And to win, we must reconfirm our commitment to our values, be proud of our civilization, culture, democratic system, the rule of law, and free market economics. We need to know who we are and what we're fighting for, and recognize our adversaries for what they are: oppressive, authoritarian enemies of human dignity and freedom. Then, like in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, the democratic West can win.
Ariel, thank you very much, and thank you for doing that paper. Okay, Evelyn, we'll start with you. All students of Russian history are familiar with its great victories against powerful invaders, Napoleon, Hitler, and even Charles IX. Some observers see Russia as an unstoppable adversary, some very prominent people, and in connection with its war in Ukraine, talk about Moscow's quote unquote mathematical advantages as guaranteeing victory. Ariel presents a much more nuanced view of Russia's wars and Russia's potential. Does Moscow's past wars provide any insight into its invasion of Ukraine?
Well, thank you very much, John, Ambassador Herbst, and of course Dr. Cohen, Ariel, for this fantastic paper. I agree wholeheartedly that we need to do more to help Ukraine. The way that this differs, of course, most substantially from the previous examples that you gave is that this is an invasion that Russia conducted on its neighbor. So it's not a case of Russia being invaded by Napoleon or other powers, but in this case, Russia is invading its neighbor. So it has a disadvantage because, of course, it has a disadvantage in terms of morale. For the Ukrainians, this is an existential fight. For the Russians, while they may try to paint it as existential, it's not existential for the Russian people. It may be existential again for Vladimir Putin if he thinks that if he loses, he might lose power and maybe even his life, although I'm skeptical of that because we've seen other Russian leaders be dispatched to the dacha and not have to lose their lives. But it is a distinction that we need to, recall and take heart. The reality is that the Ukrainians will not be subjugated to Russia as far as they, can help it, and they will fight to the death to protect their sovereignty, or at least many of them will. Also, of course, Russia has a disadvantage in terms of intelligence. When you are being invaded, you know your territory, you know what you're defending very well, and that gives you an advantage. In the case of Ukraine, as we know, Russia had poor intelligence, and I believe continues to have poor intelligence about what they're facing in Ukraine. Having said that, they do have numerical superiority when it comes to manpower and, of course, munitions. And as I think the Russians like to say, quantity has a quality in and of itself. So we cannot ignore the fact that the Russians do have an advantage. And in a war of attrition, if the West does not step up, given the current numerical disadvantage that Ukraine faces, Ukraine will lose. So that is a reality, and that unfortunately is something that Russia does have an advantage on their ledger. The other one, of course, is the fact that they're willing to just send their people into what we call the meat grinder, and maybe they call the meat grinder. They're willing to just send humans into to just a wall of Ukrainian artillery and small arms in order to fight to live another day. So while their strategy and their intelligence, which informs their strategy, is lacking, they do have these advantages in terms of their ruthlessness, their callousness towards their own men. And then, of course, the fact that they are fighting with complete disregard for human rights also gives Russia, I suppose, in a sense, an advantage because they will pummel citizens, and they are basically conducting a war that's also a completely out-and-out terrorist war against the citizens of Ukraine. So that is also something that certainly when it comes to destruction and taking territory is an advantage, but it's also a disadvantage. And the Ukrainians have learned to harness that in order to get the sympathy and the support of the Western democracies and the international community. So I think, the similarities can only go so far. But at the end of the day, I would have to agree with the conclusion of the paper, which is that we, the West, need to put more on the battlefield. We need to be smart and allow the Ukrainians to continue to use their ingenuity to outwit the Russians.
Well, thank you very much for that full answer. Sergey, one of Moscow's mathematical advantages is the size of its economy as well as its military industry. The IMF, using Russian government data, says the Russian economy grew at approximately 3% last year, and some cite that as proving sanctions are not working. Your thoughts on that? And also, Kirill Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, believes that Russia will face an economic crisis in the next 2 years as Putin moves to a war economy. What do you think, and how badly has the war and sanctions hit the Russian standard of living?
Thank you, Ambassador, for those questions. And I want to start congratulating Ariel with a nice paper. It's really nice. I read it with a great interest, and I am very happy that Ariel said very openly that all other options except of victory of Ukraine is the defeat of the West. Moreover, he pointed the price. The price is enormous, and as I see, the West is not ready to pay this price. So that means that the West is going to lose. But answering your questions, let me start with Kirill Budanov. I don't know his professional capabilities, but I never heard about him as economist. So let's keep it aside. Let's keep it aside because I believe that a lot of his statements are more of a propaganda. It's not bad. Propaganda has reason to live moreover in the country that is under invasion. But let's not talk seriously. I am more close to the IMF numbers. I believe that Russian statistics, of course, it falsifies data with inflation. It makes it playing with deflators and so on and so forth. But still, Russian economy is growing, and what we see, the most evident indicator is the budgetary revenues. They are close. They are non-oil and gas revenues. They are close right with this forecast or this estimate of 3% a year. What are mathematical advantages of the Russian economy? First of them is not, okay, I don't know, is there a quantitative something in mathematics, but definitely it's quantitative, it's not in quality. Many Western experts, they live in the past. They believe that the Russian economy today is inflexible as was the Soviet economy. But the Russian economy is a market economy where the price is the indicator of changes. If there is supply-demand ratio, if there is some dysfunctioning of the economy, the price will change it. And answering the question about sanctions, sanctions is some impediments to the economic development, is some constraints. And in any country, in any business, if the business meets some constraints, it adjusted. Okay, if you want to survive, you increase your costs, you increase your efficiency, you are looking for ways and means. And finally, the reason why Russian economy was able to survive the Western sanctions pressure is because it is market-oriented, it's market-based. So all what we see with this parallel import, with import substitution, with great channels of moving US chips, Korean chips, I don't know, Taiwanese chips to Russia, it's about market forces. So it's private individuals, they're looking for profits and they adjust their behavior. So on the one hand, yes, sanctions worked, and we may see that oil production in Russia declined by more than 15%. The plywood production in Russia declined by more than 40%. The car production, assembling car production in Russia declined by, I don't know, 60%. Yes, that's the result of sanctions. But nevertheless, Russian economy was able to adjust itself, and the main reason because it is market one. Another one very important, just looking for the future, and all experiments with oil prices or trying to limit Russian export proceeds, do not forget that Russia lives in the ruble zone. And there is another component of the equation that is called the exchange rate. So even if oil price, if Russian oil is sold with a discount, I don't know, $7 per barrel, $10 per barrel, $12 per barrel, Russian ruble was 74 rubles per dollar in the beginning of the invasion. Nowadays it is 93. So we see that this more than 20% devaluation of the ruble produced a lot of ruble revenues for the Russian budget, and that is enough for Putin to finance the war. Yesterday, the Russian government submitted its budget for the next year to the parliament, and I was able to look through the numbers, and I would see that, yes, I agree with Ariel's conclusion that Putin is exhausting its financial resources. Yes, there is no more money in the budget to finance the war. Yes, it seems that Russian military complex cannot produce more weapons than it produces this year, but that doesn't mean that Russian economy is weak, Russian budget will collapse, and Russian economy will be in tatters. No, Putin's economy is not efficient, but it is very stable.
Thank you. Okay, Dov, you've had significant responsibilities overseeing the Pentagon's armed procurement programs. While Russia's stock of weapons at the start of the big invasion was enormous, and its arms industry much larger than Ukraine's, it has been reduced to using tanks produced in the 1950s and has been relying on North Korea for ammunition and missiles and Iran for drones and missiles. What does that indicate about Moscow's arms industry and its ability to sustain its military operations? Also, what has been the impact of tech controls on Russian weapons production?
Well, I agree to a great extent with Ariel's conclusion, but I also agree with Mr. Alexishenko's evaluation of where Russia is right now. The thing is, they have moved to a war economy, and because they've moved to a war economy, you're not going to see an uptick in production immediately. That's why they're still getting shells from North Korea and equipment components from China and so on, drones from Iran. But the buildup will continue. And as the economy builds up in a military sphere, if you recall what happened with the United States during World War II, that is how we pulled out of our depression. GDP will actually go up. And for that reason, it seems to me the question is not what will happen in the future. It is rather, how do you prevent what you think is going to happen in the future by doing things now? To me, the issue is one of urgency. Look, the idea that the Russians are a bunch of losers happens to be wrong anyway. Yes, you can point to 1905, you can point to 1917. How about the 18th century, where they basically cleaned the Turks' clocks all over the Black Sea region? How about when they fought the Swedes, Poltava in 1709 and in the Great Northern War, and when they essentially knocked Sweden out of the military warfighting business after 1808, when, by the way, that's when they got Finland. And they also were able, if you recall, in the Winter War, and there's an excellent book that just came out by a Finnish historian about it, they were able to really push the Finns hard once they changed their leadership. Marshal Voroshilov, who was initially in charge, was nothing but a political hack. Marshal Timoshenko was a heck of a general and seemed to have survived he did survive the purges of 1937. So the Russians aren't all that bad. Again, it's a question of building up. And if they can build up, if we allow them to build up, then we've got a real problem. The key is, yes, I totally agree with Ariel's prescriptions. Sanctions are critical. Just make it that much harder for them. It's not going to stop them, as Mr. Alexishenko said. It won't stop them, but it'll slow them. And then, of course, it's the provision of arms. And here, I think the Biden administration continues to essentially deter itself every time Mr. Putin screams nuclear. He screamed nuclear before we sent Bradleys. He screamed nuclear before we sent tanks. He screamed nuclear before we agreed that F-16s should go. Now it's, oh, no long-range systems. And then the backup excuse is, well, it's not going to make all that much of a difference to Russia. Well, if it's not going to make all that much of a difference to Russia, why is he threatening to go nuclear? Of course it's going to make a difference. They need to get more F-16s. They need to get more defensive systems. And by the way, I think Ariel's right as well. I don't think our country is going to go on a war footing, but there's no doubt that we could move from 1 shift a day, 8 hours a day, to 3 shifts to get the equipment and the armaments, the shells and so on that the Ukrainians need now. The issue, in my view, is now. If we don't do this now, then I think Russia will recoup. And remember, it's not only Russia that knows how to recoup. Look where we were in 1942. The Russians were in pretty bad shape in 1942 as well. Forget about Napoleon. Think about 1942. They came back. If we don't do something now, they will come back again, and we will all regret it.
So something you just said put another question into my mind, which you're perfectly positioned to answer. This war has demonstrated how material heavy a great power confrontation would be. We do not have nearly enough arms ourselves, never mind what we give to Ukraine, if we faced a confrontation with either Russia or China. The administration has talked about this problem, but done very little about it. Ditto in Western Europe. What do we need to do to truly move to increase our arms production? What politically must happen?
Well, let me also begin by saying that Ariel's hope for Europe, Western Europe, to do more flies in the face of the fact that there's already pushback because of the guns versus butter decision. The Europeans have, since World War II, opted for butter over guns the whole time. It's very hard to change that. We're different. In Vietnam, Mr. Johnson decided he would go with guns and butter. And I think that's the issue. The economists will debate till the cows come home whether we're running up huge deficits to the point that our national debt will outstrip our defense budget. It's virtually it's virtually doing that already. But then again, I mean, clearly, if you want to do what you're suggesting, John, the answer is you're probably going to have to raise taxes. So the issue then becomes, what is more important to the American people? Having to face a Russia that could dominate Europe. And remember, we still trade an awful lot with Europe. Or paying something more in taxes, or maybe raising the Social Security levels. Social Security was created when people were dying before they were 65. That's why it was set at 65. People are living quite a bit longer now. So there are options to increase revenues. And if the revenues can be increased, and I believe they should be in one way or another, then I think we have the money to really pour into the defense budget and do the kinds of things you've just been talking about.
Okay, thank you. Sandy, much is made of Russia's manpower advantage. Yet, like Kiev, Moscow is finding it harder to put new soldiers in the field. That's why we see bonuses growing for volunteers, the use of convicts, and foreigners. Despite the claims that Putin is determined to see this war through to victory, he has studiously avoided the one measure that would ensure a large supply of new soldiers, mass mobilization. Why? And what does this mean about Russia's war effort?
Okay, thanks very much, John. And thanks, Ariel, for a very interesting paper. We just heard some very big questions from Dov, but let me answer your question directly. Clearly, both sides face very serious manpower challenges, but Moscow does have a structural advantage because of its larger population and its readiness to absorb enormous casualties, seemingly without limit. At the same time, the Russians understand this is politically not a politically popular war. Moscow has, from the very start of the big invasion, even though we consider it somewhat silly, insisted on calling it a special military operation rather than a war to be won, since admitting that it was a war would imply a readiness to fight even harder for victory. And they know that that would be politically unpopular and potentially risk another wave of large-scale immigration, which could exacerbate the brain drain and be an embarrassment to Putin after all this time. So instead, by projecting a kind of strategic patience and limiting the impact of the military operation on Russians' everyday lives, Moscow has so far been able to convince the majority of the citizens that everything's going at least well enough, if not exactly according to plan, as they say, and to buy into Russian propaganda that it's a war against the West that Russia simply can't afford to lose. The Russians have, as you mentioned, managed to recruit enough volunteers to sustain the war effort with higher salaries, with signing bonuses, releasing criminals from jail, without having to take the political risks involved in another partial or large-scale mobilization. And they've conspicuously avoided conscripting significant numbers of young Russians from Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other big cities, who Russia's experience shows could be tempted to engage in anti-war or anti-Putin protests. So they've recruited disproportionately large numbers of non-Russian ethnic groups, as well, in the belief that they're relatively apolitical and unlikely to complain compared to the liberal urban elites. So overall, the civilian population has been fairly docile since the start of the war, thanks in large part to the harsh repression and the crackdown and long prison sentences given to dissenters at the beginning of the war. The financial inducements that they provided may be expensive, but I think the regime must consider them as relatively affordable, particularly with GDP growing and with sanctions increasingly easy to endure or to evade. So what does this mean for the Russian war effort going forward? I think it's fair to say that support for the war is likely to remain roughly as it is, broad, not necessarily deep, but with continued protracted war attrition that will convince Putin that he can continue to wear the Ukrainians down, make incremental gains, and keep up the bombing of critical infrastructure without having to face the politically unpalatable choice of mass mobilization. I would say that thinking of how we could counter this, a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive or a dramatic Ukrainian military success, such as another bombing of major military sites, such as just happened in Tver, or occupying another chunk of Russian territory like Kursk, could shake public confidence in Putin and increase pressure from supporters of the war for large-scale mobilization that hasn't been considered necessary in recent months. So I would argue that the West, and this is in Ariel's paper as well, needs to have a much more aggressive information campaign exposing the corruption, the tactical blunders of Russian military commanders, which could at least begin to help undermine public confidence in Putin's handling of the war. Thus far, I don't think our information efforts to date have been very effective in that regard, as Ariel said in his opening remarks. Thanks.
Sandy, thank you. Evelyn, as the great Russian historian Kluchevsky wrote during the late Russian Empire, Russian expansion abroad is often accompanied by growing oppression at home. And we have seen a brain drain, Ariel's paper mentions it, since the launch of the big invasion and the tightening of social controls. The drain increased even more after Putin's unpopular partial mobilization in the fall of 2022. What significance does this have for Russia's future, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, about 1 million people left Russia in the first year after the February 2022 invasion. And those people were predominantly, I think about 86%, according to a French study, were under the age of 45. And they were educated, they were college educated. So they were kind of the cream of the crop in terms of Russia's intellectual manpower. These were skilled workers. This is, of course, a huge loss to Russia, but probably one that isn't an immediate, something that will be felt immediately. And I have to defer to Dr. Alexashenko because I am not an economist. But certainly that has an impact. The innovative, talented pool has shrunk. The other thing that we can't forget is that there were about, I think, 2,500 or more scientists who also left Russia in that time period. And if you follow the kind of strands of news that come out of Russia, you will see that there's an active effort to clamp down on dissent among the scientists. So several of them have been accused of treason in very high-profile cases. And there have been also, of course, murders of scientists. So that has a chilling effect on innovation, on trust in the system. So that can't be ignored. I don't know, again, I'm not an economist, so the immediate impact is unclear, but it means that Russia is going to continue to rely on its, natural resources in order to boost its economy, in order to keep the revenue flowing. Innovation is not something we can expect coming out of Russia anytime soon. And of course, Russia is going to rely increasingly, I think, if you look just at the scenario in terms of skilled workers and availability of workers, period, because there's also, a lack of sufficient numbers we hear, although there's a question mark about whether that ultimately influences the Russians' ability to create or to have access to munitions because of their dependence, because of their partnership with China, Iran, North Korea. So we've already heard about that. But I think this dynamic also is something that contributes to the dynamic of Russia being increasingly dependent on China, on Iran, and oddly on North Korea. So it's not encouraging for Russia, but I don't know that we should think that everything is going to pivot immediately because of the brain drain. I will note, though, that Ariel is not alone in his recommendation that we continue to encourage brain drain and do everything we can to achieve a greater brain drain. Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Garry Kasparov have been very actively promoting and trying to work with European governments to get visas and other means to encourage and to protect scientists who wish to leave Russia. That is part of their plan for the future, the new future of Russia, and their plan to try to accelerate a shift from this aggressive Kremlin regime that Vladimir Putin is running to something that's more democratic and more friendly towards the West.
Thank you very much. Sergey, I would also welcome your thoughts on the brain drain. As well as that, I have another question. Some analysts before 2022, the big invasion, claimed that Russia had reformed its military after the Georgian War and had a modern, efficient fighting force. The results of the invasion have not validated that. In his paper, Ariel points to the problem of corruption as one possible reason for this, and the ongoing problem, as we read regularly, of corruption-related arrests of senior officials and officers extorting their soldiers, and the non-payment of contract soldiers. What is the impact of corruption on the Russian war effort?
Ambassador, on brain drain, I would disagree. On the one hand, I would agree with Evelyn, who said that it's not the issue of today, and I would say that 1 million of Russians who fled the country in 2022 is the upper limit. Maybe the real number was a little bit less, and according to different estimates, from 30 to 40% of them came back because they were not able to adjust themselves in other countries. They were not able to get job permits. They were not able to open banking accounts, and so on and so forth. So it's a problem, and I would not overestimate the effect of this brain drain. Because, for example, for the key economy, for the current economy, for the 21st century economy, all what is related to IT technology, software engineering is a crucial importance. And the Russian government was very capable in raising payments to this sector, providing new job opportunities, providing new state contracts, and very few of software engineers left Russia. So all of them, they stay in Russia and they're happy. They're happy. They don't pay any price to the war, and they are safe from the war. On the other hand, I would be very cautious with all ideas. On the one, I support that the West should try to initiate additional brain drain from Russia, but we have to recognize that in the long run, let's imagine that Putin stays in power another 10 to 15 years, and we are able to launch a huge brain drain from Russia, let's say 2 to 3 million people, most advanced, most energetic, most ambitious. And after Putin will leave the power, will leave Kremlin, what will happen with Russia? Who will transform Russia after that period? So it's not an easy question. It's not an easy question, but no visible impact on the current economy. I would say that mobilization and drafting people to the war plays much more significant role on the labor resources, because it drains the men with age from 30 to 50 from industrial or agricultural companies. So that is the labor force that is driving the Russian economy mostly. As to corruption as well, I will say that there is a very well-known Russian anecdote on this topic. The price for vodka increased 50%, and the father came home and says, "Look, son, vodka is very expensive today. Father, will you drink less? No, son, it's you who will eat less." Yeah, so that's about corruption in all the military procurements. We remember that starting from 2010-11, Putin launched two huge programs of rearmament after the Georgian war. The overall price of this rearmament was something like 20+ trillion rubles. It's enormous price. 25% of this money were spent on Russian Navy, that is completely useless for any strategical purposes or tactical purposes. When Putin started the invasion, it occurred that Russian army is not ready, is not capable to run the land war with armors that were produced in the previous 15 years. Okay, Putin relaunched military economy, he relaunched military complex, they produce maybe not very sophisticated weapon, and corruption makes these weapons more expensive. That means Russia spends more money. Putin will never limit his, budgetary limitations will not limit Putin from continuing the war. For him, is he ready to spend 5% of GDP on the war? Yes. Is he ready to spend 6%? Yes. Is he ready to spend 7%? Yes. So it's not guns and butter. It's guns, and if we have something left, it will be butter.
Thank you very much. All right, Dov, one remarkable facet of the war has been Ukraine's innovation in weapons development, especially naval drones, which drove the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol, and aerial drones, which have taken about 12% of Russia's refined oil production out, and an ever-growing number of weapons depots. A year ago, people were predicting that Russia would overwhelm Ukraine with drone production, but it has been evident for months that Ukraine is ahead in the fast-evolving drone war. What explains this, and what should we learn? Dov, are you with me?
Sorry, I was muted. First, let me say that economists rarely agree, so I don't entirely agree with Mr. Alexashenko in the sense that now that they've got a much more apparently not terribly corruptible defense minister, who obviously will recognize that spending money on the Navy right now is not the right way to go. And of course, it depends which Navy you're talking about. They're continuing to spend money on ballistic missile submarines and probably will spend more in that regard. They won't spend money on the Black Sea Fleet for obvious reasons. But as to your question about Ukrainian drones and generally Ukrainian innovation, for a start, it's a smaller country than the United States. If you're comparing them to us and why we're so slow, they have, unlike us, they are forced to innovate. Necessity knows no law. We, of course, operated pretty much the same way in World War II when we had to innovate, when we had to produce en masse. They are clearly very agile. They are risk takers. If you look at the way we do our business in defense, we don't take risks at all. They take risks, and some pan out, many do not, but those that pan out make a huge difference. And so you have a flexible, agile production system that looks at operational requirements immediately because they're in the middle of a war, adapts its industry to meet those specific requirements, and gets them out in the field quickly. Actually, they're a wonderful model for the United States because we are still functioning in a 1950s or really 1960s system with results that the Chinese are running circles around us. If we operated anything like the way Ukraine operated, the Chinese wouldn't be running, we'd be running circles around the Chinese. So I think that agility, proximity to the front, interconnection with the operational leaders, and a willingness to take risks all explain to a great extent why Ukraine's doing so well.
Thank you. Sandy, Ariel's paper posits 4 possible outcomes to the war. Military victory for Ukraine, the liberation of all of the nearly all of Russian occupied territories, including Crimea. Military defeat of Ukraine, loss of territory, limitations on the military, and forced neutrality. 3, an armistice freezing the conflict along the current lines, as in the Korean model. 4, continuous low-intensity fighting along a relatively static line of contact. How do you see this war ending, and what policy recommendations would you have for the U.S. and NATO to achieve the right outcome?
Okay, that's a pretty big question to answer in 2 or 3 minutes. And of course, a lot hinges on the results of the U.S. presidential election. So we should be having this debate again in a couple of weeks. big question, of course, is whether the U.S. And its allies are going to continue to provide military support to Ukraine after the election. My view is that of Ariel's scenarios, a Ukrainian defeat is actually the least likely. And I say that even if Trump wins and he tries to negotiate a deal with Putin, I think that any such deal is likely to fall way short of minimum acceptable to Ukraine. And even if it's disguised as a negotiated peace by the greatest negotiator of all time, I think it's less likely to work. And I think there's a growing recognition among U.S. political leaders, including most MAGA Republicans, that even a partial victory for Putin in Ukraine would deal a devastating blow to our interests, to the rules-based international order. It would validate the changing of sovereign borders by force, and it would only embolden Putin after regrouping to continue with his declared aim of resurrecting the Russian Empire. And of course, Xi Jinping would be quick to follow suit in regards to Taiwan. So I think a military victory is therefore likely to remain the declared goal of the Ukrainians and of its Western supporters going well into 2025 and the next big fighting season. And I think that's the right goal. At the same time, the outcome will depend in part on whether we're going to give Ukraine enough military support to actually win, or whether we're going to continue to give them just enough not to lose. I'm afraid we're going to be somewhere in sort of the gray area in between those two extremes, no matter what is the outcome of our election. And I think that means that at some point next year, the Ukrainians are going to have to face the reality that they may have to settle for less than their full war aim, which is evicting all Russian troops from Ukraine and restoring Ukrainian sovereignty. I think they may, after conferring with the US and the major allies, decide that trying to freeze the conflict along the line of contact through some kind of armistice, or just by allowing the conflict to wind down to a manageable war of attrition while they take a long view on how to rebuild their defenses, may be the best they can do. So I think whatever the choice the Ukrainians make, and it has to be ultimately their choice, our policy, Western policy, needs to continue to include both arming the Ukrainians for many years to come, so that they will be able, in the longer term, to deter future Russian aggression, and at the same time moving ahead now rather than waiting for years to begin the process of Ukrainian accession to NATO. Will that happen? I'm not making the prediction, but I think that more and more there's recognition by our allies that only an Article 5 kind of guarantee is going to ensure Ukraine's survival as a sovereign state. And the sooner we come to that realization, the better.
Sandy, thank you. We're going to do a lightning round right now. All the other speakers have a chance, no more than 35 or 40 seconds, to respond to this question. Evelyn.
Yes. Oh,
The same question.
Same question. In other
no, I
words,
may need
the
you to
outcome of this war.
repeat it. Sorry.
The outcome of the war. 40 seconds.
I mean, I already said that I do not believe that Ukraine will allow itself to be subjugated by Moscow. So at the minimum, you will have, an ongoing irregular warfare and resistance. But I also believe that at the end of the day, Ukraine will win with our help, because there's too much at stake for the West.
Thank you. Okay. Sergey, also 40 seconds.
Ambassador, my desirable scenario, of course, the first in the list of Ariel, it's the Ukrainian victory. But I've been to Ukraine 2 weeks ago, and I would say it is the less probable, at least at the moment, because their military support of Ukraine is at a very low level, and the capability of Ukrainian army to resist is limited. We have to recognize that modern war, you cannot run the war to reach the draw. Yeah, you either win or either lose. And in the war without weapons, you can do nothing.
Thank you. Dove.
It all depends on whether we will arm Ukraine quickly. And when I say arm Ukraine, I mean really fulfill all of Zelensky's demands. If we do that, I think Putin will find that it's probably in his interest to sit down and negotiate. Once they negotiate, a deal could look like Ukraine joining the EU but not NATO, Russia and Ukraine having a deal like East and West Germany did, which essentially would give Russia access to the EU, some kind of referendum in Crimea, as well as maintaining the borders of Ukraine as they should have been, as they were, the international borders, but giving those in the East who want it Russian language priority, Russian culture, and so on. A deal is possible, but it's only possible if Putin's willing to negotiate, and that won't happen unless we arm the Ukrainians now.
Thank you. Ariel, last word for you on this.
This is a critical moment for the West. We need to recover our capability to win and recognize that in global conflicts, and I see Ukraine as a theater of a global conflict against the coalition that primarily led by China, and with Russia as a second, an important second fiddle. In that global conflict, we need to be able to win. That means, as Dov mentioned before, and as a debate in Washington rages, that means our ability to increase the GDP allocation to military production and rebuilding our military capability for two major theater conflicts. That includes the Pacific and Europe.
Thank you. Okay, questions from the audience. We have a question from the class of Dr. Sergei Erofeev at Rutgers University. The question is this. Concerning Putin's domestic opposition, what are some concrete actions American citizens can take to help them in their information campaign? Sandy, you want to give that a shot?
Yes,
Okay.
I have.
Sandy or Sergey?
Me? Oh,
Sandy.
yeah.
Okay, Sergey, you first, and then Sandy.
Okay.
Okay, Ambassador. Thank you. Russian population is 145 million people, and Russian citizens have approximately 20 million satellite dishes. Multiply by 3 number of members of the family, it's about 60 million people can reach signal from satellite. If the West is able to launch a consolidated, full-fledged TV channel, Russian language, with entertainment, with short news breaks, that means 40% of Russian people will be able to get truth, to get news about what's happening in the world. The price of this project is less than $100 million per year, but nobody is ready to finance it.
Thank you. Okay, Sandy?
Yeah, well, I would strongly endorse what Sergey just recommended. And I think we need to look back at the Cold War in terms of building up again exchanges, bringing more younger people, students to the United States and to Europe to give them both experience in building democracy, but also using it as an opportunity to debunk the kind of propaganda that they've been absorbing since Putin took power. So I think the information domain is the most important area where we've been doing far too little.
Thank you. We have a provocative question from Duncan Mills. Is there a danger for the enlightened democratic world prolonging the war because of the pressure from the military-industrial complex? Could this be a factor behind the prevarication of the Biden regime delaying precision long-range strike capability to Ukraine, weaponizing fear of Putin's empty rhetoric of going nuclear? Evelyn, you want to give this a shot? Evelyn, can you hear me? You have to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. What was the first part of the question?
Basically saying that maybe the pressure of the American military-industrial complex on desire to prolong the war explains, for example, it's not allowing Ukraine to use our long-range weapons in Russia.
Yeah, no, I think that the U.S. military-industrial complex would be happy to sell as many weapons as fast as possible, but the problem is that they can't produce them. So they have been doing everything they can to ramp up and to be creative. Lockheed Martin opened a facility in Texas with the Turkish workers. I mean, it was incredibly innovative to make sure that they could manufacture more ammunition that goes into small arms. So, you know, the military industrial complex, if anything, has an incentive to, you know, produce as much as possible. They don't look at, as you know, from corporate America, you know, they're looking at short timeframes, quarterly, you know, reports to their shareholders, and they're looking at their stock prices, which fluctuate quite quickly. So much as we would like our corporate industry to be sometimes more strategic and focused on the long term, that's not really how they work. But we need to be on a better war footing. So I think the premise of the question is off. I would disagree with that argument. I think our military industrial complex is doing what it can to actually manufacture more. Their incentives are clearly to help the US government.
We have a question from Anonymous. Dov, this is for you. What role does the $50 billion Western loan based on the Russian frozen financial assets play in shoring up support for Ukraine? How can both Washington and European capitals ensure steady military and economic support for Ukraine?
Well, as I said, there's money available if we want to make it available. A $50 billion loan, you know, we could lend Ukraine the money as long as we know that they're not going to pay us back. And so I don't, you know, I don't see a problem with it other than, you know, a willingness on the part of the administration, just like it needs to spend more money on defense. It needs to make this money available because Ukraine has to be economically viable. Otherwise, it's not going to win the war anyway. I would also point out on the previous question, because the implication was that the military industrial complex wants the war to continue. That is not the case at all. I mean, it is a very conspiracy oriented view. Quite frankly, the market for American weapon systems is as big as it's ever been. And to the extent that what we provide the Ukrainians now and enable them to win, as opposed to dragging this thing out, will simply be an advertisement for the superiority of American weapon systems. So actually, it works to the questioner. It actually works the other way. If you're in charge of Lockheed or Northrop or Boeing or whoever, what you want to do is to demonstrate now that your systems defeated their systems, and you'll have a much bigger market afterwards.
Thank you. Okay, last question comes again from a student of Dr. Erafeev at Rutgers. What are the realistic long-term ramifications of the ostracization of Russia in the international community as a result of the conflict? Sandy, over to you.
What was that key word? The
Ostracizing of Russia. In other words, the isolation of Russia.
Well, I think, of course, maintaining sanctions and strengthening them is one element of that. But I also think that doing more, as we were just discussing, to counter Russian propaganda, takes some of the illusions from the eyes of Russian citizens, so that we can contribute at least to erosion of public support for Putin's war. So I would emphasize those points.
Thank you very much. We're already past 11 o'clock. I'd like to thank Ariel for a wonderful paper, our panelists for a terrific discussion, and all those who've tuned in for tuning in. And we'll be doing a lot more on Moscow's aggression in Ukraine in the weeks and months to come. Thank you.